going to go ahead and call the meeting to order. First order of business, do we have any introduction of bills? Seeing none, we will move on to our presentation today, which is a Kansas Unemployment Insurance Update. Phillip Hayes, Vice President of the Arnold Group. Welcome to the committee, Phillip.
Good morning, thank you. Appreciate the opportunity to be here. What's interesting is today is January 26th, and exactly 1 year ago today, myself and Jeff Oswald from Unemployment Insurance Services came up and spoke to this committee, and then the afternoon to the House committee, which is exactly what I'm doing today. Although I have better news today than I did last year, and I'm just going to kind of highlight and run through some of the updated information. I know there's been some committee member changes, so I'm going to highlight a little bit of our journey last year just to give you kind of background perspective, the heavy lift that we did then, and then a little bit of cleanup work that we've got in front of us this session. So I'm just going to reset my computer here. That come through. I do. What's sad is my graduate degree is in information systems management, and it's bypassed me because it's been too many years now. So there we go. Perfect. So as I stated earlier, my name's Phillip Hayes. I'm with the Arnold Group. That's my full-time day job. I've been with the company for nearly 2.5 decades. I've also served on the Kansas Employment Security Board of Review. So this is the UI Claims Review Board at the state level. I've been on that committee since 2014. I'm actually kind of in transition. They're trying to roll me off. My term expired last June. My successor will be in front of this committee here shortly, I would assume, in the next week or two for the confirmation process. Connor Cross is her name, and just a phenomenal candidate. So, and then also most recently this past summer, I was appointed to the Kansas Unemployment Compensation Modernization and Improvement Council. So this is the council I serve on with the chair of both commerce committees and other individuals. And then most recently, I was appointed to the nominating committee for the UI board. So all things UI, I guess, is kind of an easy affiliation with me. I've been in the UI space for the better part of 15 years now in Kansas, and looking at reforms and trying to improve the system, better responsiveness to claimants, as well as serve the employer community as well. So kind of what we're going to run through today is kind of 5 big buckets. I'm going to probably zoom through item 3 just because it's the bulk of the presentation. I certainly want to save questions or time for questions throughout. If you have them, I'd certainly be willing to answer them throughout or at the end or at the appropriate time. But just to kind of walk through from last March or March of 2020 through where we are today, just to give this some perspective, the national initial unemployment claims that the United States seen from the onset of the pandemic through the close of January of last year. You can see the initial huge spike on the front end. Kansas mirrored the U.S. economy on the very front end. And I liken this to, I said last year, the Mamba or the whatever the big roller coaster is at Worlds of Fun. But we kind of got on the kiddie roller coaster throughout the early summer, throughout the fall, and then we got back on the big roller coaster, and we weren't tracking with the national trends. And when we came up, the latest data that we had available, Jeff and myself, a year ago, was week ending 1/23 of 21. And Kansas at that time ranked I would say it's number 2 on a per capita basis. We only trailed Illinois, and California trailed us. So we had a huge open spigot of fraud concerns from the business community. One of the things that we've often asked ourselves, not only with DOL and the business community, is why was Kansas such a rich target? And it's because of, I would say, our maximum weekly benefit is relatively in the top third of all states. So when the onset of the pandemic hit, we were at a weekly max benefit rate of $488. And as the pandemic continued on, we leveled up to 503, and now we're currently sitting at 540. This will likely go up again July 1. You can see those were pretty steep increases. This is indexed at 55% of the average weekly paycheck in Kansas. So it is indexed, and there is a control mechanism. So as we prosper as a state, this amount is going to go up. And quite honestly, I don't know that it's a bad thing if we had the right security parameters in place. But when you started stacking on the $600 or the $300 extra federal benefits, that put a weekly benefit amount over $1,000. And now we would be north of, we'd still be in that negative, or that bad, I say negative territory, where potentially somebody could earn significantly more on unemployment than they were gainfully employed in attached to our economy. So to some degree, I would say that was some of it, but then also I think the fraudsters just went around poking holes and looked for the vulnerable states. So in looking at kind of the history and how this unfolded, the business community engaged with KDOL and legislators 28 times from March 24th of 2020 through January 31 of 2021. And to some degree, I felt like the employer community voice was largely dismissed. We were kind of saying the sky is falling. Jeff and myself a year ago came in and said we estimated the fraud to be between 300 and 600 million. That was a huge number. They said there's no way that's possible. And why I highlight this today, and I don't want to be up here throwing stones, but if the employer community is seeing something, I think we've earned the opportunity to voice our concerns and hopefully have a quicker response and not such a lag on some of the concerns that do present. So again, the 300 to 600 million, it was a wide range, and we were looking at not only traditional Kansas trust fund dollars, but then also the impact of the federal dollars. So ultimately, we just were not good stewards of these tax dollars as a state. Just to give you some idea, because some of this information was not presented last year, the 4 weeks leading up to the multi-factor authentication solution that was put in place the last weekend in January of last year, we were seeing north of 80,000 claims, initial claims in a single week. That got revised downward to right under 26,000 for week ending 123. But if you look at the full highlighted row 12, our traditional regular UI claim dollars out of our trust fund, we were paying north of 30 million, 31 million, 34. It climbed up to $44.5 million in a single week. The last week before we put the MFA in place, we were pushing out $32.2 million. So on average, for that 4-week rolling, we were at $38.2 million over the course of January of 2021 on a weekly basis. As I stated, January 27th, the day after Jeff and I came up and testified, it was announced by the governor that we're going to shut the system down. We're going to put some fraud measures in place and identity theft verification pieces. So Kansas went with the MFA, the multi-factor authentication. This has really kind of become commonplace in all of our lives and the touch points and everything that we deal with online. We ended up with a LexisNexis solution. There's a number of providers that are out there. This seemed to work extremely well because when you look at the post-MFA activity, and again, kind of going through the same exercises, we elected not to look at week ending 130 and February 6th because we wanted the dust to settle out from that solution being put in place. So looking at a 4-week average from 2/13 through 3/6, we dropped from 38.2 million on average per week down to 6.5 million. So it was a significant drop. Our claims count went down to a little over 2,300 compared to that 82,000. And so when you look at the math, 38.2 million compared to the 6.5 million and the impact of the multi-factor authentication, our weekly claims from our Kansas Employer Trust Fund dollars decreased nearly 83% with that one solution. So this was a great solution. Unfortunately, we just didn't have the timing right and it wasn't implemented on the front end of the pandemic. So going back to the LPA, I think the part one of the Kansas Legislative Post Audit was presented before session concluded last year. Part two was released in August, so off session, and the findings from there, the amount of fraud that was determined by LPA did increase from 200 million for Kansas traditional unemployment trust fund dollars up to 344 million. Collectively, though, we are just under $700 million that LPA's final audit identified for Kansas unemployment in the state of Kansas. The Modernization Council that was stood up from House Bill 2196 last year has been meeting pretty routinely since June of last year. And Senator Erickson joined the committee when she was appointed to chair Commerce. So she's attended one meeting. She's got some background on this, certainly more to follow. But what's interesting is KDOL's response to the LPA Part 2 audit is they have a high degree of confidence that there's a total of $380 million in fraud. And there's no dissection between traditional versus federal dollars. But the Modernization Council has contracted, or the state of Kansas has contracted through the advisement of the council with BKD. They're a local, or they're a national firm, but they have a local presence in Kansas. It's my understanding that that audit is underway. There's kind of a two-part piece here. The first report due by BKD is due May 1st of this year. So, and then the final report is going to be on September 1st. And there's kind of two separate pieces to those deadlines. The first one is more of, do we sense that there was some security breaches or did we have some security loose ends that weren't buttoned down? And then September 1 is really going to be kind of the numbers audit piece that's going to come in and flesh out their findings. The good news is BKD has actually partnered with other states and they've got some systems in place that they're going to obviously use as a foundation and build from. They're working closely with LPA and we're not going to recreate that wheel. So this will be interesting as the year develops. The Kansas Department of Labor did release some software security updates throughout the pandemic from February until the middle part of September of last year. This was the last report that KDOL did issue with these metrics. So within the course of 7 months, there was nearly 200,000 claimants attempting authentication after the MFA. The bottom piece, 7.8 million bot or fraudulent login attempts against the Kansas Department of Unemployment system. So we had nearly 8 million within a 7-month period. And then we cut off and we haven't seen any updated reporting numbers on this avenue at this point. So it's pretty telling the amount of bot and fraudulent login attempts, unsuccessful login attempts within the first 24 hours of the MFA solution being in place was north of 1 million. And so Kansas, again, was kind of a high-risk target for a lot of the fraudsters. What's difficult, and I think what really gets lost in all of this is, I think there were syndicated big crime ring fraudsters that were infiltrating Kansas's system because it was such a rich target. But the legitimate Kansans, the legitimate claimants that were displaced from their work, and there's still claimants that are out there that are struggling with this. I know the call volume has subsided significantly since last year, but I do know that continues to be a continued problem. At the end of last year, so this was reported toward the end of February last year, that we turned over 50,000 cases that KDOL suspected to be fraudulent. So this just captured really the first 8 to 9 months of the pandemic. So from March through December 31 of 2020. We don't have a count or a number or quantification of the additional fraud cases that came after 1/1 of 21. And when you look at the earlier graphs and charts, January is when really Kansas had the explosion of the fraud that hit our state. So I'm curious, and honestly, I don't know that I want to see the number. I certainly do, but I think it's going to dwarf this and shadow the initial 50,000, or at least come close to it just within a 4-week period. And why yes.
If you don't mind, I'm going to stop there. That's a lot of information, and see if there are any questions from the committee up to this point. Senator Dahl, if you don't mind, just so we can address them as we go. Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. You know, we get this percentage of fraud and such that's still going on. Prior to the pandemic, I'm sure there was some fraud going on. What's the difference? I mean, are we getting close back to prior?
Yeah, and that's a great question. And this is something that we as a business community have been monitoring. I try to keep a pulse on this. I actually kind of have some metrics that I run and look at on a weekly basis. And as we get a little bit further in the presentation, I'm going to give you some idea of what that, and one of my carve-outs is looking at the 4-week period prior to the pandemic kicking off, and then the most recent 4-week period. And I think we'll be pleasantly surprised of where we are. Still some work to do. But it shows to some degree that we're back to pre-pandemic levels.
Could I follow up?
Yes, Senator.
And the other thing probably is in your presentation, but unemployment numbers prior to the pandemic versus what they are now, is that in here?
It is.
Okay, thank you.
I was telling Natalie Bright earlier that I feel so much more comfortable coming up here, and I want to anticipate questions that are going to come up. But so I've tried to build in a pretty comprehensive presentation to answer some of these questions, and we're going to dig into some of those for sure. If we could go back to the slides now.
Yes, please proceed.
And so April 28th of last year, the Federal Trade Commission released a report related to identity theft for 2019 compared to 2020. And unfortunately, Kansas earned the top spot at #1 with an 1,800% increase in reported identity theft cases. And so when you look at it visually on the map, we're certainly the bright red state right in the middle. But just to bring some perspective here, Kansas from 19 to 20, actually in 19 we ranked 39th in the nation. 2020 we ranked #1, and we went from 19 reported identity theft reports per 100,000 Kansans to 371 per 100,000 Kansans in 2020. In 2021, which they did capture first quarter only, we escalated up north of 1,200 ID theft reports per 100,000 citizens across the state. So just to give you some perspective, we went from 2,200, or a 6% increase from 18 to 19, an 1,800% increase from 19 to 20. We dropped 16%, which is great, but we're in my opinion, we were at a worse spot. We're even more elevated from first quarter, and 2021 as a whole has not been reported out yet. I suspect it'll be sometime in the next couple of months. So kind of getting back to your question, Senator Dahl, the UI Weekly Review, which is a report that's published by the Kansas Department of Labor, it's typically pushed out midday on Tuesdays. I was hoping that I would have had updated information today. I did update a few slides, new slides, that'll be coming up, but these trend lines really hold true even with the report that was pushed out this morning shortly after 8. Initial claims on the left, you can see the huge spike in red. This is just Kansas unemployment and the roller coaster that we went through. And then the blue line on the left picks up January, and we nearly rivaled the opening couple months of the pandemic before we put the MFA in place. The green line, which is somewhat hidden on the left chart, is closer to pre-pandemic and actually under the aggregate between 2010 through 2019 averages. So initial claims are actually under historical levels. Now, that's a full decade, but if you look at 19 alone, or 2020 pre-pandemic, we're under that just from a true year-to-year comparison as well. On the right column is the continued claims. You can see the pattern kind of went through there. So the continued claims wasn't just new claims. We had kind of the initial as well as those that were already in the system that really kind of had some staying power and continued to pull dollars out of the trust fund. The benefits occurring, again, I talked about an 83% drop. The graph on the left really illustrates how dramatic that was. On the far right is the trust fund, the Kansas Unemployment Trust Fund. Obviously, the red line indicates that you can see the sharp decline there in the outlay and the trust fund dollars that were depleting at such a rapid pace. The green line, again, the trend line for 21 or 2022 is just now starting. We are over the position that we started with in 2018 from a trust fund solvency standpoint, which is good. But if you look at the bottom blue line right in the middle, and I wish my pointer worked on the monitors here, but the huge escalation, sharp vertical line, that was an infusion of $250 million from the ARPA funds that the legislature passed in House Bill 2196. So that certainly helped prop us back up from the position that we lost. That was no fault of the employer community, and certainly did a lot of good for our trust fund. And why that's important, when you look at Title VII advances, there are 10 states with outstanding balances from the feds to date. That total is $40.4 billion with a B dollars that these 10 states are upside down, swimming in the red. What's really unfortunate is we have there's 12 states that have accumulated more than $280 million in interest in the last several months. So the interest, and this is why I was banging the drum a lot and saying our trust fund was going to be depleted by mid-March of last year if we didn't do something. And we would have been on this chart with other states, and our position probably would have been far worse at the pace that our fraud was exposed. So I'm extremely pleased that we saved Kansas from being on this report, because this provided a challenge for the state coming out of the Great Recession more than a decade ago, and we knew the challenges with that. So this was a huge win, still work to be done here. Going back to Senator Dahl's earlier questions as well, and I know this print gets a little small. You also have an electronic version of this, so zooming in will become a little bit advantageous. But I'm going to pull my... actually, I'm going to, some of the language or the closed captioning is getting in front of some of my points here. But what I do want to draw, thank you. If you look at the far right column, so actually the red, this is the third from the left, third from the right, the full pandemic summary. This is the last 94 weeks since the pandemic started. Even with the escalation of the fraud dollars and additional claims, you can see we have paid out $1.27 million nearly $1.3 billion out of our traditional trust fund. $13.3 million average weekly benefit amount. If you look at the gray column there in the middle, the current 4-week summary, so this is from 12/25 of 21 through January 15th of this year, we have paid out a total of right under $12 million out of the UI Trust Fund to the tune of right under $3 million a week. If you look at the green column, this is the pre-COVID 4 weeks leading up to the pandemic onset. We had roughly $14.2 million collectively through that 4-week period on an average of $3.5 million. So you can see our trust fund is actually, or the withdrawal rate on the trust fund is about 16% under over the last 4 weeks compared to the first 4 weeks or the last 4 weeks of pre-pandemic. Claims, regular claims are up 38% right now. This number was actually a lot closer until the last few weeks when we're starting to hear whispers of additional fraud starting to elevate back in Kansas now, and we're going to get to some of that. But what's interesting, for me, the big takeaway on the internet claims, because the internet claims is really where we were most vulnerable on the fraudulent claims. This really trailed off and leveled out after the MFA solution, but over the last 3 weeks, it spiked up as a percentage of new claims coming in. And I really think that this is a telltale sign, at least one of them. So certainly, I would hope that this is on DOL's radar as well and kind of looking at this. Chairman, I think there's a question.
Senator Dietrich.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And I'm new to the committee, so can you just tell me, when you say internet claims, you mean I'm filling out all of my information online, I'm not using the call center? Is that what you mean?
That is correct. And just to kind of backtrack a little bit, kind of the evolution of claims management in the state of Kansas, we used to be paper-based like most states. Then we had the workforce centers, and a lot of those would kind of push the paper claims forward. Then telephone was always an option to file a claim. That still is an option today, but with the internet technology efficiency, so we thought, we put that solution in place, and that's where kind of the floodgates really were open, because the checks and balances, not having the identity verification piece was really put us in an exposed position.
Any other questions? Please proceed.
Thank you. Next, I'm just going to kind of highlight some of the changes that we did last year that was included in House Bill 2196 for new members. We stood up the Unemployment Compensation and Modernization and Improvement Council. So in short, I'm just going to call it the Modernization Council. This is kind of a unique task force for the state of Kansas. It is made up of 3 employer reps. Myself and Jeff Oswald serve on this. 3 employee reps, 6 legislators, and 1 designee from the Kansas Department of Labor. So it's kind of a hybrid group, but I think we've covered a lot of ground in the last 7 months that we've met. Chairman Tarwater, or Representative Tarwater, chairs this committee this year, and then it'll alternate the chair of the chair of the Kansas Senate Commerce will flip-flop with House while this committee is in existence. But we were charged with examining and recommending changes to the UI system, conducting or coordinating an independent audit. And then there's some additional takeaways that DOL has as far as reporting and et cetera. Probably the biggest thing that I'm most encouraged to see is the development of what the strategic staffing plan, if and when the next economic downturn hits and we have an uptick of claims again. And so what does that look like? Can we be better prepared? Can we have a roadmap as far as what our response is going to do and be and so forth? So, and then we get some bi-monthly reports from DOL on this committee, and I'm going to share some of those takeaways and the metrics that we look at. And then at the end of the day, we're going to make a recommendation to the Legislative Coordinating Council on the selection of the IT vendor that will be moving forward with our IT upgrade. The Employment Security Review Board, I mentioned this a little bit ago. We temporarily doubled this. There's currently a backlog of PUA claims and other claims that are starting to stack up for the Department of Labor. We knew that this was going to be coming. Connor Cross, my potential successor for my full-time role, again, will hopefully be in front of you soon. If I don't have the opportunity or the pleasure to make it up on that day, I fully endorse her and support her in that role. But we've also got 3 additional candidates for the temporary expansion of this. So just trying to be proactive so we're not standing in the way or being a roadblock for Kansas claimants that are waiting on an appeal decision. Next, ma'am, or Chair, we've got another question.
Yes, Senator Dietrich.
Thank you. I thought maybe you'd define what the Employment Security Review Board does. Can you tell me that?
We are a board that is comprised of confirmed candidates, typically from the HR community, but not necessarily. The 3 of us currently have 15 plus years of HR and claims management experience, very in tune with the UI laws in Kansas. But what we do is if a claimant files their claim, or an employer, if either party has a decision that is not in their favor, they can appeal it to an administrative law judge. That law judge then makes a ruling, and if either party wants to appeal that, that appeal comes to us. So we're the third step in the process. The next in line would be going to district court. And if we go back to the slides, the next thing that we have are the employment security rate tables. And what we did, we passed some reforms after the Great Recession. We were looking for some parity solutions on the solvency as well as the credit tables. Ended up basically with a flat tax, and it really penalized the better actors in the space. So we re-level set this, and it's definitely much more proportional and much more fair. So there's 6 new solvency rate schedules as well as 6 new credit schedules. And if you think back to the graph of the trust fund balance, we're likely to be pushing $1 billion again. And some would argue that that's a lot of money sitting there, but we also draw interest from it, so it almost serves as an annuity. But some of this was actually in motion before the pandemic set in. We were trying to come back to the parity issues, that we could afford some tax breaks to employers if the trust fund is healthy. So that was agreed upon and compromised language between industry and Department of Labor. Didn't affect benefits with that piece of it. So this should actually provide a good roadmap and triggers for the state of Kansas for years to come. Part of this is looking at the tax rate summaries and just communicating that Kansas is a stable place to attract new businesses if they want to come across state lines or come across half the country. Our old system was an arrayed system. We got into a fixed schedule system. It's much more predictable. It's stability for employers. And we can communicate that now. The schedules that were adopted can be found on DOL's website. You can go from their hyperlinks or look in House Bill 2196 as well. The other big component I think that is a benefit for claimants is instead of at the end of the year getting a tax notice saying you're on the hook for tax consequences of receiving benefits, we put that at step 1. On the initial determination of their claim, they're notified that there will be tax consequences or liability. You can opt in to have Kansas or federal taxes taken out of your UI benefits, and then what the estimated tax burden would be. So just really reposition this notification piece for claimants. Part of the updating of the data on DOL's website is from the business community. The variables that were in the tax structure were somewhat guarded, and we had to pull teeth to get memos on an annual basis if we wanted to see what these were. So I like the transparency piece here. On the right side, what I'd like to show you from the year 2002, and this is the latest data that we have going back 20 years on the published data now, but a 20-year look-back period from 2020 or 2002, they went back to 1983 and 1982. And instead of looking at an individual year, we were looking at high-cost quarters of a year rather than high-cost years. And so I could never reconcile, based on the language that we had in statute for years versus quarters. And in 2016, that was part of our legislative changes then, that you can see the flip in 2016 through current. We're actually using high-cost years rather than, if you look at 2011 through 2015, actually, a better example is 2010. We were using 2 quarters from 2003, the economic downturn from the 9/11 events. And so instead of looking at 2003 as a whole, we were pulling out the components or the variables that really maximized the tax burden on the employer community rather than looking at individual years. So this was a huge win. And I know it's probably only for the IT or the numbers geeks out there, but to some degree, this transparency is a huge step, and it was a huge factor that we were probably overpaying unemployment taxes for a number of years in the state. My reemployment plan, Lieutenant Governor Collier back in several years back introduced this. It got sunsetted with current administration. This was reintroduced. I call it 2.0, whatever we want to look at, but we ironed out some efficiency gains between commerce and labor. This has been in place since June 1 of last year. This is an element that I think there's going to be some additional cleanup language or tweaking with continued conversations that we've had with commerce and labor. Certainly some areas that will streamline the operation and hopefully lead to a better outcome and certainly efficiency gains. Work refusal provisions, again, a lot of times what happens is the community would submit a job refusal, and we wouldn't hear anything back. We didn't know if it was actually received or not. So we just put kind of a two-way communication stream in place. If employers had 10 days to respond, we wanted that same courtesy to get a response back once we report those as well. The unemployment rate, this was probably one of the areas that received a lot of attention yesterday or last year. But you can see the state rate for Kansas has vastly improved. I think in March or April of last year, we topped 12% at a state unemployment rate and then steadily came down. Kansas currently is tied with two other states with the 14th lowest state unemployment rate. You can see how our neighbors fare. Nebraska to the north of us has the best, lowest unemployment rate for any state at 1.7%. Oklahoma is third at 2.3. Missouri is tied with 14th with us. So this is certainly pretty impactful. And going back to some of the earlier conversation with Senator Dahl, I think this is a good indication that Kansas economy is healthy, it's strong, it's robust. We've got ample job opportunities out there. Right now, we just have a talent shortage or a labor shortage. And we could probably take the one spot if we could find a way to actually attract talent to Kansas and have able-bodied individuals attached to the labor market and take on positions. So. Number 9 here, disqualification for fraudulent or misleading statements. Really tweaked the 5-year penalty down to a 1-year. There are some nuances here that your clock did not start until you paid your restitution and made the overpayments whole. So not only do you have to pay that and any penalty or interest, then you have to sit on the sidelines for 1 year after that is fully resolved. There is a level 5 non-person felony that was introduced last year, basically targeting the out-of-state fraudsters that were trying to take advantage and really look at the identity theft impact on Kansans. So certainly we'll see if this takes shape. This may have been, hopefully we don't get back into this position. That was my thought after the session closed last year. But with the sprinkling of the fraud starting up again, I've learned to never say never through the years. So next item is just really trying to make employer accounts, putting some protections that we're going to hold them harmless. And what's interesting, the conversation that we had is let's not just, this pandemic was supposed to be flatten the curve for 2 weeks. It's going to be over in a few months, and then it stretched on and it stretched on, and we're about to hit a 2-year milestone in March of this year. We actually sunsetted these provisions to carry through to December 31 of this year, because in the event that it did carry on, which it has, we didn't want to come back and take another bite at this apple. So we felt like we'd be in much better shape going through this session, this full calendar year. But the good news is we've done a lot of good work to ensure that any fraudulent claim dollars tied to an employer account has been reconciled, they've been given credit back, et cetera. And then there is also a provision for the reimbursing a lot of the nonprofits. They were carrying a lot of bad debt, and there's no way that the state was going to recoup those. So we put some solutions in place that made them whole, and they weren't carrying around excess debt, for lack of a better term, for a decade or more. We essentially wiped that away from them, but we've got our eye on it to recoup those dollars from the individuals that still owe an overpayment. Federal relief aid transfers, I kind of hit on this a little bit ago. We've seen $250 million that was added to the trust fund July 11th of last year. The deadline to put that in place was July 15th. Now we still have the other 50% of what was allocated or appropriated last year. And that's largely going to be tied to that independent audit. And if you remember that date, that's September 1. Which is after the statutory deadline of July 15th. That doesn't necessarily matter, but since we got the first infusion, we're going to be in the standard or the neutral table. So this really has no bearing. I'd certainly like to get those dollars, but I think until that independent audit is released, that's going to tie to the amount that the trust fund will actually inherit from those ARPA dollars that are set aside. The other thing, there's going to be a gap, obviously, whether it's from July 15th or September 1, because we did set provisions that go through the end of this year. So we'll see how that reconciles out once the final reporting comes out. Number 12, the UI Trust Fund Projections Report. This was just a provision that was put into place to have DOL report to both Commerce committees at the outset of each legislative session for the next 3 years. I believe Kansas Department's on the docket tomorrow for a noon presentation, joint committee. So essentially, they'll be satisfying this component, but there'll be something that they'll be presenting that I didn't, will be what their projected trust fund will be on June 30, when we actually close the fiscal year, what that looks like, and if their projections maybe carry out a little bit further based on claims, current claims levels, et cetera. 13, the shared work program modifications was, I think, a big win. And during the Great Recession, Kansas was one of the most promoted states that utilized their work share program, but less than 10% of employers across the state utilized it. So even though we were one of the best, we still have a lot of runway in front of us as far as having other employers utilize this tool and promote it and educate them that it's out there, that they could avoid a full layoff and they could almost do a pro rata, work some hours, get paid unemployment hours for some of your workforce. If we have a skilled workforce, we don't want to let them go because opportunities may be greater in other states. We don't want to lose that talent. So if we can keep them attached, keep their benefits in place, et cetera. But we tweaked this and increased the work reduction from 20 to 40. We went to 10 to 50%, allowing more flexibility in today's work flex environment and different employer schedules. And then we also elected to have negative balance employers be able to participate as long as they're on the trending upward path, that they're not utilizing more or causing more of a detriment to the fund than they're moving forward with. So, last thing before I get to our last expanded point here is the law enforcement partnership with KDOL. Representative Estes came to this on the House floor last year when the House Bill 2196 was being debated, and contacted some law enforcement, primarily the Sheriff's Department. So I've propped them up, the Kansas Sheriff's Association. You can see the Sheriff's offices as of Monday who are in agreement with DOL. And essentially this has taken away the congested phone lines, inability to get in touch with a DOL representative to go verify your identity if you're having some trouble with the MFA piece. You can go to the sheriff's office or a local police station that is on record with the department, present your I-9 documentation. The law enforcement officer will verify your identity, and then they submit that to DOL. So it's really been a huge boon for DOL to leverage or lessen the demand on their resources. At the National UI Conference that I attended last year, myself, the Secretary, and the Deputy Secretary of Labor went. We had roundtable discussions with other states, and this was one of the big things that other states took away as a huge kind of response mechanism that would have afforded them some, probably a little bit more sanity. We had a couple of, the last 5 items are really kind of some cleanup pieces. I won't bore you with those. I do want to get into some of the metrics that the Modernization Council receives from Department of Labor twice a month. So if we look at the My Reemployment Plan, and these are cumulative totals since June 1 of last year, we have more than 30,000 Kansans that have engaged or at least applied on the My Reemployment Plan. There's 20,400 that are in compliance. You can see the non-compliance. And then on the far right of that top line is the number of active claimants engaged with the My Reemployment Plan. Now, 5188 is over the number of initial claimants, but it is a sampling of our continued claimant population. The shared work piece that I talked about, there's 165 plans in place, 126 employers. And if you ask how can that be, an employer can have 2 plans by department, by brick and mortar. They have a lot of flexibility within this, so it doesn't have to be a universally applied solution to their entire workforce. There's 4,600 employees that are on this pro rata plan that is keeping them attached to their full-time job, keeping their benefits in place, et cetera. Job refusals in 2021, when this went into effect, we've had 531 job refusals reported to the department. 411 of those were denied benefits based on the job refusal. There's 90 that the department found good cause through the adjudication process that they maintained their benefits. And since 2022 started, we've had 2 job refusal reports, and 2 of those have been denied benefits because they're not actively searching for employment. The fraud cases, the current fraud picture in the scope as of January 12th is 2,890 fraud cases still under investigation. They've closed 1,929, and they've received 108 new ones. So this 108 number resonates with me on the next few slides that we're going to get into. So and actually, I'm glad I paused here. The top call drivers within the Department of Labor, so these are the claimants, the Kansans across the state. You can see the bulk of them. There's 21% that are calling in regarding their regular UI claim. There's almost 18% that is checking on their claim processing status. They feel like they're caught in limbo. They don't understand where the roadblock is. Over 14%, there's a flagged claim. And I think this goes hand in hand with that 108, and then also the fraud numbers that I'm going to get into in just a bit. We've got legitimate Kansans and claimants that are still getting caught up in this mess. 13% weekly claim filing assistance. This is not an easy process. My future son-in-law had the unfortunate situation that he had to apply for claims recently. And he sat at my kitchen table asking for my guidance and help. And he is frustrated. And so I think there's enhancements that could come from this. This isn't actually, I was sitting last night with him, and so it didn't make my presentation. But I think it would be good if DOL initiated a task force to sit with live claimants and listen to them talk to themselves through the process and understand the pain points, because there's certainly some work to be done. I know we're on the path to get an updated IT system, but that's years out. And there's something that surely can be done in the interim, in the short term, to help legitimate claimants. So that would be one issue that maybe is not listed. Okta is our LexisNexis, the identity verification piece. That's right under 8%. And you can see how the numbers trail from there. Kind of what we're monitoring from the industry standpoint here, just within the last few weeks, I'm looking at week ending 1/8 and 1/15 of this year. Week ending January 15th, nationally, initial claims increased by 127%. This was unexpected. They went from 225,000 to 286,000. There's an increase of about 56,000, and that was out of alignment with the estimates and how we'd been trending over the past 3 months. The previous week to that, the continued claims increased by 4.5%. So you can see we went up to 1.63 versus what they expected of 1.56. So both metrics elevated, really past kind of what the current trend lines had shown us. When we break this down from a state perspective, Kansas job claims, I feel, are spiking. Initially, I had surging here, and I don't know that that was the right word because we've seen the surge graphs earlier, but we're definitely seeing an increase here. So our initial claims last week, or 2 weeks ago now, decreased by 13%, continued claims by 12%, and internet claims increased by 105%. And I'm going to get into a little bit more breakdown, but the image here is one of the slides from the Unemployment Weekly Review that's published by the Department of Labor on a weekly basis. But for me, what was more concerning on the week of January 8th, our initial claims increased by 200%. Our continued claims increased by 113%. Internet claims increased by 300%. And what's tough is as I've been watching this for the last 3 weeks, that first week I said, okay, is it the seasonality employment? Is it cold weather? Is it winter? And so I'm going to get into a few new slides that aren't part of your presentation, but I will email them to the committee assistant and have a request that she share them with you. But when you put this in perspective now, actually real quick, internet claims accounted for 75+% of all claims submitted in week ending January 8th. Prior to that, the 6-month look back was 46%. So we've seen a huge escalation. When you look at 2018 through 2022, and I wanted to present all this data, and you'll definitely have more time to look at it in greater detail, and I'll be available for questions. Be happy to talk UI for 3 days with you if you'd like. But in 2022, you can see during week 1, week 2, week 3, so the first 4 weeks of these calendar years, compared to last year when we were on fire as a state, our claims increased 16% then. If you look at 2020, they increased 10%. 2018 was 47%. That was probably weather and more related. But in 2022, we had nearly 110% increase. When you look at week 3, our claims decreased, but they also decreased in 21 and also 18. We expect to see that, but they escalated a lot, and we have a small step back. So this is still potentially problematic for me. Just looking at 1,500 to 3,200, we're still elevated up. If you look at industry and really start taking in account the seasonality or the weather patterns, et cetera, or the winter months, this table kind of resets and it's presented only on a weekly basis in the DOL's weekly review. And what they're reporting is the highest impacted industry by raw numbers of initial claims. And so this table shifts. So I built this and put in alphabetical, left the industries the same. So when you get these slides, you can look kind of side by side, but you would think maybe construction is where the gap would be right now. And when we look at construction, we went from 523 to 878, down to 459, down to 226. We had an increase across all segments and industries in our state week ending January 8th. And I don't know that that was all seasonality. You could put COVID and Omicron in the mix there a little bit, but this is a little bit out of sequence here. We have opened some dialogues with KDOL and trying to get an idea what they're seeing, and I'm certain that that'll probably be shared whether tomorrow or in the coming weeks as we try to get a better handle on this. So. And I presented these charts from 2022, walking back to 2018, so you can certainly look at them. 2 weeks ago, I was out on the road at client engagements, and I was getting phone calls and emails and actually talking to some HR counterparts that we're getting fraud cases again. And so my 3 industries from that first sense of it was from public school districts, governmental entities, and private business. And so Kansas SHRM initiated a survey that was published after the 4 o'clock hour last Friday. And then by Monday, we had over 150 responses when people got back to their inbox on Monday morning through the noon hour. 154, we're now, as of 9 o'clock last night, over 210 responses, and we'll close the survey probably by the end of this week, and we'll have official results. If you'd like a follow-up, we can certainly provide those. But question 1, and it's only 4 questions, are you seeing an unexpected increase in UI claims for your organization? 37% said yes. This is tracking with my early indications when the pandemic came on, that we had about mid 30% is what we were projecting. There's still 8.5% that they're not sure yet. They probably haven't seen their statements, or they're out of the loop, and maybe their claims are going to a different department. So of recent claims reported to your organization, do you suspect any of the claims to be fraudulent based on the claimant listed as a current employee, or the claimant listed has never been employed with your organization? 56% that said they were seeing some fraud activity, 56% it's against a current employee. Less than 5%, never an employee, and 42% of them saying we're not sure yet. They're investigating. I would suspect that maybe those are larger organizations, or larger companies and more employees, and so they're going to have to go and look at the reconciliation piece. Question 3, have you reported any suspected fraud UI claims to the Kansas Department of Labor within the last 2 months? 50% of the participants said yes, 50% no. I think this is pretty telling. And when we look at the detail, we asked for when you started seeing your first new fraud claims. A lot of the responses were, we thought this chapter had closed and this was behind us. And largely about December 12th is kind of the earliest common date that I see. The earliest one, I think, on the report was December 2nd. And so some of this may be tied to benefit years closing and then somebody being able to reestablish a new benefit year. The part that I struggle with, that I can't wrap my head around, is with the MFA solution in place, if those were put in place, if those initial fraud claims were put in place before the MFA, we closed the door, locked the door with the MFA, how are these getting past the MFA piece now? Because when the benefit year expires and starts again, the MFA is interrupting all of that. Most of these reported dates were after January 1st of this year. So the bulk of it has come in the last 2.5 weeks. Last question on it, if you suspect fraud claims, note the date you believe they began. So 77 out of 83 that reported new fraud claims, again, occurred between December 1 and January 19th. These are the industries that were reported. So it's not just a small sliver or just a couple. It's across the board. It's hitting every industry and probably every corner of our state again. The good news is we've not seen a significant uptick in our traditional trust fund dollars going out, but it's still a huge time constraint interruption. But the concern is, even though we've not seen the correlating increase in trust fund dollars exiting, there still may be a flavoring of that occurring. And the tough thing is, I don't think we're going to get another bite at the apple if the floodgates or if there's a new sophisticated process that fraudsters are taking. ARPA dollars are limited in scope. There's a lot of them, but I feel like we did our diligence last year to take care of this, and I just don't want us to be in an exposed position as we move forward. So looking at proposed reforms, and we're working with the revisor's office now in drafting language, getting that. We hope to have the bill introduction early next week with an RS number, and hopefully you'll see what I would consider probably a pretty small bill before your committee. There's agreement that the fund control table, probably the most egregious piece is we left off 20 negative signs when we're dealing with the negative positions with the control mechanisms. So that one's super easy. KDUL has requested that the 5 decimals be reduced to 2 to 3. We still have ongoing conversations. They may come in tomorrow and present 2 decimals. At the end of the day, we just want to make sure that we're not going to retweak the table. So there's some solutions that I think we can get to, and once we get to the introduction, we'll have agreed upon language. My reemployment 2.0 or 2.1, largely this is coming from commerce and labor, and it's supported by industry on the changes that are coming, and it really is just looking at, to some degree, future-proofing this, but really also digging into and redefining a modern work search effort or activity with technology, et cetera. We're still leaning on old paper process and kind of yesteryear activities. Item 3, US DOL conformity. There's 2. This needs to be replaced with A, dealing with the shared work program to deal with a state versus isolating just a Kansas. So with that, I'm going to stand for any additional questions. I really appreciate the extended time and the platform to give you a full preview.
Questions from the committee. Senator Dahl.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Unemployment's like 3.2%, what I'm seeing. And I've been told that we right now have more people employed in Kansas than we ever have, ever. But yet I see more help wanted signs, or you go to a restaurant, you have to sit because tables are empty, they don't have enough servers. Explain that. I mean, what's going on? I mean,
I wish there was an easy answer for this. Having been in the recruiting space, the staffing arena for 24 years, this is the most challenging recruiting environment I've ever been associated with. For the last 10 months, I feel like I'm on kind of repeat mode as I have business clients, I have business prospects call and say, we need help. What are we missing here? So it's the same question. And largely there's wage pressures. You've got inflation and employers just aren't able to chase that inflation dollar. So as those go up, we lose purchasing power. I think remote work from home has impacted that, the work flex modeling. Maybe there's not a lot of opportunity within Kansas employers, but we're competing for talent. And states that are on the coast or that offer a higher piece of work from home, they are pulling Kansas employees potentially out of Kansas employment. They're staying at home. They're living under our cost of living umbrella, but they're working for an employer out of state. That's impacting. The 4+ million baby boomers that have retired since the onset of the pandemic, the amount of reevaluation of what people want out of their work-life balance, whether you call it the Great Resignation, the Great Reevaluation, people are looking for something different, and this has provided an opportunity for them to go explore the market. But we just have less participants in the market. Granted, we may have more jobs, but there is ample job opportunities compared to those that are available in the job market. So essentially, we're trading employees, and we've got this competition between employers fighting over limited talent. So last I seen, there was nearly 11 million open jobs posted across the U.S. Mr. Stafford is not in the room. I know the Kansas Chamber looks at kind of the aggregate number of job openings across the state of Kansas, and it's north of, last I heard was 154,000. I don't want to be quoted on that, but it's a significant number. And when you look at our unemployment population, it's 2,400 initial claimants, and continued claimants is relatively small, under 10,000. We have a huge opportunity if we could attract employees or individuals to the state, but every state is in the same boat. And the tough thing is the gig economy has upset the apple cart as well, as far as what has been there. So there's a lot of dynamics that are just converging all at once. And so I could go on a full presentation just to answer that question, but there's a lot of dynamics in the mix.
Senator O'Shea and then Senator Tyson.
Thank you. Yeah, good question, and I would be interested in that presentation. On page 35, you were talking about jobless claims spiking here in January. And you shared the data, but I didn't catch if you shared. I'd love to hear your interpretation of why that has spiked here in January.
Honestly, my initial, when I seen January 8th kind of unfolding before me, I thought, okay, it is seasonal. It's the winter months, it's construction, it's what. But then when you dig in the numbers far deeper, that doesn't support that claim that it's isolated to a few industries. But I think that spike really is just the opportunity that some of these fraudsters are coming back in with round two, or re-upping their bad claim to begin with. And they may have received some, or siphoned some fraudulent dollars on their first go-around, and now they're coming back to breathe new life into those potentially. I think this is an artificial spike. I don't think it's indicative of what I'm seeing kind of on boots on the ground from the employment perspective.
Thank you. They must be using their Christmas money to.
Senator Tyson.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Thank you, Phil, for your presentation. I was wondering on the claims that we're seeing, the fraudulent claims now. Last time, there seemed to be specific data and information that those claims had, such as payroll down to the penny. And I was wondering if we are seeing similar claims with similar data. Do you think there's a certain, we need to figure out where the data breach is on this stuff? So thank you, Madam Chairman.
And I don't know that I have a response on that, because this really just hit my radar, and I started compiling and looking at some of this late last week. And but from what I understand, these claims are going through the initial claim process again with labor, but they're getting shut down, at least if employers are reporting them as fraudulent. The tough thing is, I think the employer community somewhat got a little bit relaxed again, because we went through about 11 months and didn't have an issue. Felt like the lock was working. And so now it's just process it. So I think the Kansas SHRM survey that was published is renewing some interest and probably a little bit more attention to detail. So the good news is labor is aware of it, and the claims are, by and large, I don't think are getting funded at this point. But again, what we learned from the dark web chatter and how Kansas was exposed at the height of this, they won't leave us alone. If this door won't open or if this window won't open, they're going to go try another one. And they're going to continue to try to elevate and sophisticated tactics. So I don't think we can ever let our guard down.
Any other questions for Phil? Thank you so much, Phil, for the thorough presentation. Committee, I hope that this kind of gives us some food for thought as we go into our joint meeting tomorrow with KDOL. Remember, that's at noon in 112 North. Seeing no other business, and we will not, I've had a couple of people ask, we will not be meeting at 10:30. The noon is in lieu of our meeting tomorrow. So with that, seeing no other business, we are adjourned.